right, so let's get started. Welcome to the Symposium, Empire and Beyond. My name is Yingyao Wang. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Virginia. I'm standing in today actually for Anne, director of the East Asia Center, to moderate this panel. Anne had a sports injury and she is joining us online today. So we truly miss having you here in person, but she has allowed us to wave at her through the camera. So today, we are very fortunate to have four world-class thinkers to discuss a topic that holds both historical significance and contemporary relevance, that is, empires. And I have the honor of introducing our four panelists. Each speaker has an extraordinarily long list of prestigious publications. I think honestly it will take me 1 hour to just go through them. So I will just highlight maybe only the aspect of the biographies that is most relevant, immediately relevant to our discussion today. And unfortunately, Brian has put together a pamphlet that has the biographies on it. I can just kind of read it through. It's very pertinent to actually go through the biographies. So Professor Krishan Kumar is a university professor and William R. Cannon Jr. Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia and author of Visions of Empire, How Five Imperial Regimes Shaped the World, as well as Empire's Historical and Political Sociology. We are also here having Professor John Owen, is Ambassador Henry Jr. and Miss Marianne R. Taylor Professor of Politics at UVA, a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and the Miller Center for Public Affairs. His latest book is The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile World Order. And this book has won the 2025 Grawemeyer Award in World Order. We are also very fortunate to have Professor Keping. Professor Keping is University Professor, Director of the Institute of Urban Governance, and Director of the Research Center for Chinese Politics at Peking University, as well as a Distinguished Professor and Dean of School Government at Shenzhen University. And his most recent book is very timely and directly relevant to this discussion today, A Theory of Empire, which is published in Chinese. And Professor Yu is currently a visiting scholar at UVA. We know that he has been engaging in a list of a series of talks and discussions with our local community, especially with sort of a slowing down the use of US-China intellectual exchange. We highly appreciate that Professor Yu has made the effort to be here and to be really engaging with local community of scholars. We also have, last but certainly not least, Professor Brantly Womack. He's a professor of foreign affairs emeritus here at UVA and also a senior faculty fellow at the Miller Center. He's the author of a recent book, Recentering Pacific Asia, Regional China, and the World Order, as well as Symmetry and International Relations. So to facilitate sort of more organic flow of the discussion, Brantly actually helpfully suggests that we should go and proceed in the following order. We will start with, and everybody can agree upon that this is a good order. We will start with Krishan and followed by Keping and John, and lastly, Brantly, if that's okay with everyone. And I will explain a little bit in my broad discussion to why this particular intellectual order is actually making a productive sense here. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Krishan Kumar from Department of Sociology to share his thoughts.
I suppose many people might be wondering why empire? Why on earth should we be thinking about what for many people is very much a past issue, a dead issue? Empire as a history. Why might we be interested, apart from a kind of antiquarian interest simply as historians, in the field of empires? And so what I want to do is to try and explain two things, really. One is, why might empires have become interesting again to people today? And secondly, what might we get from the study of empires? So first of all, why should empires return to the agenda? Because I think there's no question that it has. There are all kinds of ways of seeing this, the volume of books and articles which have been streaming off the presses since the early 2000s, whole television programs. There's a very famous British historian, Neil Ferguson, gave a series on the British Empire, which was a kind of huge success. And then the book followed, which was even more successful. There's clearly a kind of appetite. I understand there are all kinds of video games, which I don't play myself. There's a very popular one actually called Empire. So what's the reason? Why should empire become interesting again? And I think one of the reasons is that although people talk about empires as things of the past, perhaps the era of empire is not actually over. It's true that most of the formal empires came to an end, the first wave after the First World War in 1918, when the great land empires, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman empires collapsed after 1918. Then after 1945 came the turn of the great overseas empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, all gave up their empires. And I suppose we could say that for many people, the last empire was the Soviet Empire. Not that the Soviet Union ever thought of itself as an empire, quite the opposite. But many people, and Russians since 1991, have also been prepared to talk about the Soviet Empire. So let's agree the Soviet Union was a kind of empire, and it collapsed in 1991. So isn't that the end of the imperial story? Well, I think there are some candidates around at the moment which may not be called empires, but seem to act imperially. There is a concept of informal empire that's been around in the literature for a long time. Maybe we're dealing with some of these informal empires. I mean, the obvious suspects are, first of all, the American empire, which is, I think in many ways, the whole debate about empire was relaunched in the early 2000s by the American invasion of Iraq. I mean, if you look at the literature, the kind of spike in the literature, you see around the early 2000s, so many books coming out talking about the American empire and then opening up the field to comparisons. If America is an empire, is it like other empires? You know, in what way can we see America as an empire? So I think America was really important in relaunching the whole study of empire. But then we've got the Russians, of course. People talk about Putin restarting the engines of empire in Russia, and certainly he seems to have all kinds of ambitions which look like an attempt to recreate, if not the Soviet Union as such, but something more like Greater Russia, which is another term for empire. They want to extend Russia into some of its historic lands like Crimea and Ukraine. And then what about the Chinese? Again, China and the Chinese would absolutely reject any notion that what they're doing in the world today can be thought to be imperial. But we've heard of things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which for many people has certain kinds of imperial overtones. It might be soft power, it might be empire under a different guise, but the extent to which China is extending itself in the world, the extent to which it's funding all kinds of projects in Africa, South America, and then to some extent getting those people to become something like dependencies. You know, many of them become indebted to China. They can't pay back these huge loans for infrastructure problems. So it is a kind of way of a creeping form of empire, which is creating dependencies all over the world. And then, I mean, it may be not thought to be serious, but some people have talked about the European Union as an empire. That's a subject of lively debate among Europeanists. In what sense can the European Union be thought to be an empire? Particularly in the relation to its eastern members, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, now taking in potentially other East European countries. There seems to be, again, a kind of dependency going on here. They're the rich West European countries, the pioneers of the European Union, and they're drawing in, as almost like subordinates, East European powers that are often far less powerful within the European Union. So there is a sense, some people have compared it to the old Habsburg Empire, some people have compared it to the old Holy Roman Empire. There are a number of models that people have used for the European Union, but the word empire has certainly come to be attached to that. So maybe empire has not ended. Maybe we are seeing signs of empire in various ways around the world, and that might be a good reason for looking at empire as a phenomenon. Second thing, a very familiar thing, the so-called crisis of the nation state. The nation state is said to be too small for the big things and too big for the small things, even though it's the kind of normative unit in the world community, and the United Nations exists in a sense as a symbol of that normativity of the nation state. A lot of people don't see the nation state as in itself the active actor on the world stage. There are still superpowers. There's the Security Council of the United Nations, which shows the continuation of massive inequalities in the nation-state system. I think that accounted for a short-term movement of something rather clumsily called glocalization. I don't know whether you heard that term, glocalization. It's kind of linking the global and the local. For a while in the 1990s, that was quite a popular thing, certainly among social scientists, that was the way of the world. Two ends against the middle. The global and the local kind of squeezing the nation state in the middle, because the nation state seemed itself to be not particularly plausible as a unit. But it didn't last. Why did it not last? And I think one of the reasons, again, is very familiar, is that because nationalism, even whatever the state of the nation state, the movement of nationalism had not lost its hold. And as we've been seeing in recent years, there's been a massive recrudescence, it seems, of nationalism. Various kinds, racial, ethnic, religious, populist. And that's a formula, it seems to me, for unending conflict. The principle of the nation state, one nation, one state, is a recipe for endless conflict, because very, very few states, I think maybe a handful, maybe 5, exist in the world today in which you can say that the state corresponds to the nation. Nearly all states are in some degree multinational, at the very least multi-ethnic. So if you adopt the principle of nationalism, you're instantly creating the sources of conflict of various kinds. So again, I think people are wondering whether something in the history of empires might give us something, some kind of model that might be an alternative to the nation state and to nationalism. Can we find ways of dealing with the kinds of problems that we see around us in the world without resorting to the nation state, which does not seem to be a particularly effective way of dealing with these problems? On the basis of that reflection, people talk about empires as having had a very long history of the management of diversity. The management of diversity, I think, is one of the key elements. You know, we can discuss definitions of empire endlessly, but one of the things empires are defined by, I think, is the fact that they are in control of, or they have to manage a good deal of diversity, cultural, ethnic, religious. That's been the history of empires ever since the beginning. So maybe the ways they manage diversity, which does seem to be a challenge to all of us today, maybe the ways they manage diversity has something to teach us. That too, I think, is just a question for us to talk about. Now, of course, immediately people are going to say, yes, well, empires may have been quite good at managing diversity, and you might say one or two positive things about them, but basically they're exploitative, they're oppressive, they're frequently brutal. In what ways can we possibly look to empires? Isn't it a story, a kind of nightmarish story, which we're lucky that we've gone beyond now, that we are woken up from the story of empires? Ought we even to be talking about them, let alone thinking about them, and still less, in any sense, advocating a revival of empire? All of those points are absolutely correct, of course, but I think it's worth remembering that if empires have been exploitative and brutal, then so have most states. There's nothing distinctive about empires in that respect. The nation state certainly has shown it can be as exploitative, as brutal, as oppressive as any state, and certainly as any empire. So I think the frequent charge, because there's a kind of empire wars going on in the scholarly world at the moment, the idea that empires are wholly bad, that their whole history has been a history of absolute disaster, catastrophe, and there's no way in which we can learn anything from them. I don't think that's true. And I think it's partly because there's this kind of focus on empires at the expense of comparing them with other forms of states that have existed in history. So I think we still have the right, I think, to consider them in terms of what they can teach us. If we're looking at global institutions as possible ways of thinking about coming out of our predicament, of responding to our current challenges, then it's worth remembering that two of the most important global institutions that we know of in the 20th century, the League of Nations and the United Nations, were quite explicitly modeled, or at least inspired, by empires. That's become very clear from the work, particularly of the historian Mark Matsar. He's written a couple of books about the origins of the League of Nations and the United Nations, and he points out how important the British Empire was in both cases. The figure of Jan Smuts, South African politician, who was at the birth of both of these global institutions, is in itself an indication of the way in which the British Empire fed into these institutions. The way in which the British Empire was organized, apparently, was a very important inspiration for thinking about the way both the League of Nations and the United Nations were organized. So we can talk a little bit, I think, about the imperial origins of international institutions. Again, with all the qualifications we might want to make about the actual empires and how they might be used to offer us models of international institutions. But the historical record suggests that they were indeed important in the way in which those two great institutions, the League of Nations and the United Nations, were set up. And so my final point, really, coming back to this, is to think about the variety of empires. They come in all shapes and sizes. There are land empires, there are overseas empires. And whether by reflecting on the historical experience of these different kinds of empires, we might not get some ideas about how we might handle our problems today. And my kind of favorites here, and I'll leave you with these examples and maybe we can talk a bit about them. There's the British Empire, which, as I've said, was already important in the case of the origins of the League of Nations and the United Nations. The British Empire that evolved into what was first called the British Commonwealth of Nations and then simply the Commonwealth. Whatever you think about the Commonwealth, I think it has been, in many ways, a success as a way of keeping groups of people together who might otherwise be at odds with each other. So there's the evolution of the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations. And some of my other favorites, the Ottoman Empire, with its millet system, again, a very well-known feature, the extent to which the Ottomans, until right to the end, until they began to be challenged by the rise of Balkan nationalism and then indeed their own nationalism, Turkish nationalism. Nationalism has always been the enemy of empire. But the Ottomans, I think, until that period, were very good at managing the different groups, particularly the different Christian groups that they had within the empire. They have a very long history, I think, of great success in managing the multiculturalism, if you like, of their empire. I think the Habsburgs were the same, far-flung territories across so many parts of Europe, a land empire like the Ottoman. But again, I think they held that together pretty successfully for a long time. And they showed different faces to different parts. So that the Emperor of Austria was the King of Hungary. He had different ways of relating to the different parts of the empire. I think that's also true of the Chinese Empire, which might seem an odd one to bring into this discussion, but in many ways I think is a very relevant one. The Chinese Empire is often seen as totally isolated from all the other developments and not like any other empire, but I'm increasingly aware that it had many features that were very similar to many empires. And one of them, again, was the way in which the Chinese emperor related to different parts of the empire in different ways, showed different faces to the different parts of the empire. So if we take the example of the Qing Empire, the last dynasty, the Qing emperor was one thing to the Tibetans, he was another thing to the Mongolians, he was another thing to the Muslims of Xinjiang, and he was another thing to the Han Chinese. I mean, it's fascinating to see the way in which empires adapt to the variety of peoples. And it's a matter of necessity. It's not that they necessarily like them, and there's always a sense that they are, to some extent, second level or second rate compared to the dominant ideology of Ottomanism or Islam or whatever is the ruling ideology of the empire. But nevertheless, they're tolerated and they're allowed to, and they're accommodated. They're allowed to continue their own ways to a good extent. So I offer you these empirical examples, historical examples, as ways of thinking about our problems. I think empire, if I may say that in this way, empires are good to think with. I think they've been long-lasting. They are, as many people have said, the default form of human organization since the beginning of human history. The empire is the form in which human beings have been organized for most of our history. So maybe there's something there. Maybe they have been able to show by their own success that they are able to handle a lot of the problems, even of the kind that we face today in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishan. Let's welcome Professor Yingyao.
Good afternoon to everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here to participate in this symposium on empire. So thank you very much, Professor Brantly Womack, for your getting me into this symposium. So the topic I'm going to talk is the fate of empire and imperialism in the era of globalization and digitalization. So I would like to use PPT. The second issue of the Journal of Tsinghua University published my article, A New Theory of Empire, in 2022, which unexpectedly attracted a large number of readers shortly after its release. This article was selected as the most popular among 99 articles published in the journals that year, and received the Outstanding Paper Awards from the journal, which has been given over the past 5 years. Why? Because the article was published exactly on the day the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, February 24th, 2022. The publication of this article also drew the attention of several publishers in China who approached me to request manuscripts to publish for publishing monographs, even promised to offer me high royalties. I finally chose the People's Publishing House of Zhejiang Province, my hometown, to publish this monography. To my surprise, this book also became one of the bestsellers of that year. I really got a little big money from publisher. So what attracted so many readers? In addition to clarifying the fundamental concepts of empire, hegemony, great powers, imperial ruler, and imperialism from an academic perspective, I specifically warned all rulers that pursuing the dream of empire in the contemporary era is not only bound to fail, but will also inevitably lead to disastrous consequences. Our article and book on empire has not got attention not only in China, but also in Europe and even in Russia. A European magazine translated one of my interviews regarding empire, while a Russian newspaper published a lengthy interview on the topic over 5 consecutive issues. So what are my main arguments? Basically 2 main points. First, the era of empires is over, but imperialism will continue to exist for a long time. No country, no matter how powerful it is, and no matter how persistent its leaders or political elites are in dreaming of empire, can become an empire. Second, the rulers of major powers in pursuit of empire will not only bring more disaster to their own people and the peoples of the occupied nations, but also to the whole world in the era of globalization and digitalization. To my understanding, the era of empire has gone for good. British Empire was the last of human powers, and with its dissolution, the era of empires was officially brought to an end, whether people like it or acknowledged it as a universally perceived political value and a political structure of national power. empire has exceeded the course of world history. The era of empires is gone for good. Empire is neither worth pursuing nor possible nowadays. Why? For me, there is at least 4 reasons. Firstly, the main tools for establishing an empire, i.e. military expansion and conquest, has been completely abandoned by mainstream human civilization. After World War II, any major power's military expansion or occupation was no longer seen as legitimate and were universally condemned by progressive forces worldwide. Second, the fundamental moral foundation of empire, which was based on inequality between nations and peoples, has lost its legitimacy. This inequality between nations and peoples has lost all moral legitimacy in the modern world and fundamentally contradicts the United Nations Charter. Thirdly, the fundamental driving force behind the creation of empire no longer exists. Even the most powerful countries, when evaluating the cost-benefit ratio of war, often find that waging war is ultimately not worth the costs. For example, the Vietnam War waged by the United States. First, no matter how strong a dictator's power and abilities are, or how ambitious his desire to conquer other countries, they cannot establish a modern new empire with the power of a single nation. However, unfortunately, imperialism will persist for a long time. Why? Because there will always be rulers and nations attempting to conquer, occupy, and dominate other countries and peoples. There will always be intellectuals and scholars who continue to advocate for and justify the rationality and the necessity of the imperialist system. For me, empire and imperialism are often difficult to distinguish, but they are different concepts. An empire is the political power structure of a state, whereas imperialism is a value choice, theoretical stance, and a series of domestic or foreign policies that state rulers adopt in their pursuit of external expansion and aggression. Even though empires have exceeded the stage of history, there are still several powerful nations today that continue to implement imperialist policies. The main reason for this can be summarized in 3 points. National superiority. These powerful nations are often former empires, and the glory of the imperial area has become a part of their political tradition, deeply embedded in the memory of both political elites and the general public. This creates an inherent sense of national superiority, and imperialism can, to a significant extent, satisfy this sense of superiority. Second, the will to power. The desire for power is essentially a form of possessiveness. When the supreme ruler of a power state is an autocratic dictator, and there's no system in place to effectively limit their power. Pursuing imperialist expansionist policies often become a natural choice. Third, material interests. By implementing imperialist policies and exerting political, economic, and military control over other countries, powerful countries can derive many tangible benefits. When a powerful nation holds a dominant position over others, it can establish the military bases in the other countries, eliminate trade barriers, and gain various political and economic advantages, thereby significantly increasing its own security, economy, transportation, trade, and cultural interests. In the era of globalization and digitalization, there are new forms of imperialism. The forms of imperialism will evolve in line with the characteristic of globalization, digitalization, and networking. Imperialism has already transitioned from military imperialism, economic imperialism, and cultural imperialism to forms suitable for the contemporary global or digital era, such as financial imperialism, digital imperialism, digital colonialism, and cyber imperialism, among others. My conclusion is the contemporary world needs a new global order. After the World War II, the global order of empire was replaced by the global order of sovereignty nation states. This was a historical advancement because although the collapse of the imperial system did not eliminate war, it has prevented large-scale global wars from occurring since then. However, the era of globalization or digitalization presents new challenges to the system of national states, particularly challenges to global security order. So both the logic of historical evaluation and the logic of imperial ruler tells us that returning to an imperial system cannot be the correct solution to the security challenges facing humanity in the era of globalization and digitalization. The correct path is to follow the inherent logic of globalization and digitalization, actively explore and establish a global order based on shared human destiny and global governance. As an optimistic idealist, I'm firmly an advocate of good global governance. For me, good global governance maximizes the public interest of all global actors and the common interest of the international community. It is the optimal state of international order. It is the best cooperative model between governments of different countries, as well as the best cooperative model between global civil societies. Just as good governance is the ideal state of national governance, good global governance is an ideal state of world governance, and it represents the moral force of the international community. There are so many awful challenges to good governance, to good global governance. And so there will be a long way towards good global governance. And the values of imperialism is the most urgent and dangerous challenges to it. So all people over the world should unite and collectively oppose all imperialism of any new forms in our times. So I do hope this symposium on empire is one of such efforts against imperialism. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Keping. Next, let's welcome Professor John Owen from Department of Politics.
It's a real privilege to be here with these colleagues and to talk about our ideas and to kind of move through an intellectual progression like this. So, and thank you all for coming out. I look forward to our conversation in a minute. The title of the symposium is Empires and Beyond. So the first, maybe the one way to frame what I'm going to do is I'm about the beyond, but the beyond, there's a question about whether you ever are really beyond, as I think has already been raised here. So, and what I have to say will, I think, overlaps in interesting ways with what's already been said, but maybe has some differences as well. I want to lay out an argument about how, not really about formal, it's not about formal empire. It is about what I call hegemony, but that's a term international relations people use, borrowing from the Greek word for leadership. There are many different ways to define hegemony, just as there are many different ways to define empire, but I'll unfold what I mean. And I'll start with this, that nation states have interests, but they have twofold interests, if you will. Externally, typically they want security, they want power, they want influence, but they have internal goals as well that they consider part and parcel of the national interest. They want, and most to the point for me, is they want a particular domestic regime which they believe will deliver wealth, stability, development, and so on. And governments typically believe that the internal and external go together. That is, at least they don't want to be in a world where they have to trade off the internal for the external and vice versa. So, for example, to take a case from distant European history, in the 17th century, French elites in France typically believed that France was most powerful and secure and wealthy if it was an absolute monarchy. An absolute really meant had a king unconstrained by a parliament, by localities, by a nobility, by a judiciary. That was the way. If France had a different domestic regime, it was going to be an inferior country. It might fall apart, or it might be picked apart, bullied by its neighbors. So it really had to be. So the interest was in a particular domestic regime, but that was because there was a strongly held belief, rightly or wrongly, that that domestic regime was the way to international stability and security. The second point, there's something we can call the international environment. And I don't mean the natural environment, the seas and mountains and so on. It's really a social and political environment. This affects how easily states can secure this twofold national interest. The international environment can press a state, for example, to be an absolute monarchy and support it in its absolute monarchism, or it can press a state in various ways to become more constitutionalist. And the environment, by environment, I mean things like international rules, institutions and practices, information, the distribution of power across the system, the distribution of regime types. So how many absolute monarchies are out there already in the world? A third point, great powers, these are the countries with the most power, have the ability and the incentive to shape the same international environment that shapes them. So there's a back and forth. They have an incentive, and they often try to, what I call, engineer their ecosystem for the sake of the national interest, for the sake of this twofold national interest. So they recognize, oh, we're in an environment, it can make it easier or harder for us to be an absolute monarchy, but we have the power to affect that. We can shape the environment that's shaping us. Now, there are many, many ways great powers have done this over the ages. One was by building empires, building formal empires. We want to grab territory and exploit it, integrate it into our political economy in some way. The era of formal empire, even though the legacies remain, the era of formal empire is over. I want to agree with my colleagues on that. But there are plenty of other ways great powers have affected their environments. One is by weakening their enemies, strengthening their friends. But the way I want to talk about is by setting international rules, building international institutions, putting information out there into the world about how superior you and your system are, and promoting through various means your system of government in the world beyond, or at least hampering rival systems of government. So in carrying out this suite of policies, the great power is trying to rig what you could call international evolution, trying to make the environment select for its own type of country instead of alternative countries. Again, all for the sake of the national interest. So, for example, returning to 17th century Europe, the France of, excuse me, Louis XIV did this ecosystem engineering. It waged war. It tried to overturn the Dutch Republic, a neighbor. It was threatened by the idea of republicanism, and a neighbor was afraid France itself might become a republic. It propagandized about the superiority of the Sun King Louis XIV and of absolute monarchy more generally. It paid subsidies to foreign monarchs like the Stuart monarchs in England to help them become absolute monarchs themselves. And in fact, France under Louis XIV succeeded to some extent. Absolute monarchy did spread. It was the kind of the cool regime in that period of early modern Europe. Now, usually the world has more than one great power, and great powers compete, as we know, over all kinds of things. But they compete often over this ecosystem engineering. They want to favor their national interest by affecting the international environment in which they all exist. And so it follows that great powers that have different domestic regimes can be especially competitive because they don't want exactly the same international environment. A great power that's an absolute monarchy will want an environment that supports absolute monarchy. A great power that's, let's say, a republic or a constitutional monarchy will want an environment that supports constitutional monarchy. In other words, they want, to put it in evolutionary terms, they want to steer evolution to select for their own type of country and not for the rival type. So after the Second World War, the United States, one way to look at the US-Soviet rivalry, the Cold War, is as in part an effort at competitive ecosystem engineering. Trying to rig, both superpowers tried to change the environment to favor themselves and their system. So the United States practiced what political scientist John Eikenberry calls liberal hegemony in the North Atlantic area among industrial democracies. It was more coercive or imperial in other parts of the world in what we used to call the Third World. The Soviet Union had a very different order in its part of Europe, more imperial. It also made efforts to attract decolonization movements and governments in the Third World, starting with Khrushchev in the late 1950s. So you had this doesn't exhaust the description of the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans, but it's part of what they were doing and part of why they were so competitive. The Soviet Union collapsed way back in 1991, leaving the world with what IR people called unipolarity. The United States was the sole superpower, and the United States took advantage of this and tried to globalize its hegemony, to establish in more and more countries around the world what it had established in its zone during the Cold War. But part of what happened was it invited China partly into the system, and China took full advantage and rose economically during this period to the point where now China is a leading great power as well. So that brings us to today, a world in which the United States and China have many common interests. Their economies remain interdependent. So they have a common interest in trade and investment and fostering continuing prosperity. They have a common interest in preserving the natural environment. They have a common interest that's drawn my attention lately. I wish I knew more about this, but in managing the challenges of artificial intelligence, of AI. They're both racing. One of the ways they're competing is racing to develop better and better and faster AI, but they're both aware of problems of alignment, where AI is reaching the point, or has reached the point, where it's becoming agentic and its purposes aren't necessarily aligned with the purposes of the people who created it. This is a problem for both China and the United States. So they have a common interest in figuring out how to manage this problem. This is not to say that they will realize these common interests, but they are there. China and the United States, however, have different domestic regimes, and so they have some different goals for the international environment, for rules, for institutions, for information, because both states, China and the United States, each believes that its national interest is not simply in external security, prestige, influence, and so on, but in retaining its domestic regime. So in some ways this has played out in recent years. Some ways include trade. So the sorts of trade treaties, thinking back to the Obama administration. The Obama administration pressed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. And this was an open effort to pressure China, because it included, the trade agreement included transparency, labor and environmental regulations that the Chinese didn't want to sign up to at that point. And President Obama and Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, were quite open about this, that the United States wants to be the leader, the kind of rule leader in the Pacific Rim, and so that's what the TPP is for. And China recognized what this was, an effort to pressure China to become more like a liberal democracy on the Western model. And so now then came President Trump, who said we don't like this, and pulled the US out of the TPP itself, and that relieved the burden on China. But that's an example of how one great power is trying to set up a new set of international rules that will press the other great power to become less like it is now and more like itself. Similar tussling going on for years in the cyber realm. The two great powers have different visions for international cyber rules. And clearly, they have different visions for international human rights rules, and they've been contesting that for years. Now, one question that arises, and this will be, I guess it'll have to be my last point, is the Trump administration is not exactly conforming to the expectations of my argument, by which I mean, under broad conditions, governments of the United States, governments of China, they want to continue the domestic regime that has gotten them this far. They really do believe in it. Again, they believe that the national interest depends on maintaining the domestic regime. I think it's fair to say that President Trump, whether you agree with him or not, is, let's just say, less committed to the regime that the United States has had, and both domestically and also internationally doesn't care so much about promoting democracy and multilateral institutions that the institutions the United States set up after the Second World War. And so perhaps the United States under the current administration is seeking a different kind of international environment than what I've been talking about, and maybe one that overlaps more with what China is seeking. I don't know. This is an interesting puzzle for someone like me who sets great store by domestic regime differences. It might be, however, that the visions for international order of the current Trump administration and China are more distant. It's hard to read that now. But in any case, the burden remains on both these great powers to find ways to coexist in a single international environment that they share, even though they have different interests. If they don't figure that out, we could end up with two separate international orders, each hegemonic in its way, each competing for members. Something perhaps like the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans. So this is a choice that Beijing and Washington have before them. And it's important to face up to that and understand that the full dynamics of global politics and how the international environment and great powers interact. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, John. Next, we have Professor Brantly Womack, and he's going to solve all the problems the previous speaker have posed.
Well, thank you all for coming. I want to say that the idea of this being a symposium is back to the original Greek meaning of symposium as a banquet of ideas. I think we've seen some pretty spicy ideas. I hope to contribute to those. John was just ringing many bells with the concerns of the United States in global power. I'm sure that the Thucydides trap has been heard by many people, and some people think it's already snapped. Some people think the snap is coming. And that whole idea of the bipolar rivalry of the United States and China is certainly something that does exist now and is likely to continue to exist. But what I would like to emphasize in my remarks is something different. A return to and it relates to the bipolar rivalry, because I don't think either side can win that rivalry. I don't think that establishing a new empire is possible. And I don't think that establishing a regional empire is possible because of connectivity. So let me start with two theses. First of all, that no global hegemony is possible. Here I would agree with Keping. And I would also add to that not even regional hegemony is possible. And the reason for both of those is that the resilience of smaller states is great. They can be conquered, but they can survive, and they can successfully resist. And we can think of states as different in their initial conditions and final conditions as Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, or Ukraine. So that resistance of smaller states, that's something that's changed a lot from many of the tales of origin of empires in the past. The second thing that I think makes global hegemony impossible, and also regional, is the connectivity of actors that, as you see in Ukraine, and actually if you go back to Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam too, the international context of those conflicts is very important. International context of Ukraine, the support that it gets from the United States, from Europe, is something that sustains the internal resistance. So that connectivity of actors, it's hard for a larger power to pick on a smaller power without having all sorts of side effects that it doesn't want. And those side effects can overwhelm whatever purpose it might have. And the last thing I'd emphasize on this question of global hegemony is that what you have as a result is uncertainty rather than anarchy. If there's no global hegemon and there aren't regional hegemons, then you don't have the kind of certainty that someone in jail has of knowing where your next meal is coming from. Okay? You're going to have to find it yourself. So there's that type of uncertainty. But your potential larger powers in the neighborhood or in the world and your potential smaller powers also are facing those problems. So uncertainty is the ruling notion in a post-hegemonic world or in a post-hegemonic region. Nevertheless, here's where I think a lot of the discussion and criticism of empire and imperialism stops. But we have to go on to relative power still matters. So how does relative power matter in a situation where the larger power finds it difficult or perhaps even impossible to simply impose its will? And relative power matters because relationships are asymmetric, because there are larger and smaller countries, and the larger have more to gain, the smaller have less, more at risk in the relationship. They're more exposed in the relationship. And the second reason that relative power matters is that there are located patterns of interaction. That is, we're not talking about an abstract marketplace of powers of different sizes. We're talking about a geography. We're talking about different relationships that will continue into the future, regardless of what the future conditions might be. So that situation of a matrix rather than a marketplace is important to relative power and how that relative power structures itself. The last thing to emphasize is the multidimensional interactions, the various types of imperialism that Keping listed at the end of his talk are good examples of this multidimensional interaction. And it's not simply state to state, it's state to global economic crisis. It's state to smaller things. It's part of state to part of state. It's global value chains in the economy. All those types of things make for relative power concerns, help shape relative power concerns. So what's the answer to how does power matter beyond hegemony? The answer is asymmetric attention. When you have different exposure in a relationship, it sets the default attention pattern of the relationship. If we look at this, A is bigger than B. No. And A is far less exposed from what B can do to it than what A can do to B. So their perspectives on the relationship are different, and their attention in the relationship is different. A B is going to be a lot more alert and concerned about what A is doing. And it's not even necessary that it's what A is doing to B. If China and the United States are having a trade war, every other country is going to be very interested in that because they're big and they're small, because those countries are smaller and therefore more likely to be affected by these relationships. So it's not simply a question of military. It's not simply a question of bilateral relationships. It's a question of a generalized exposure in the relationships, and it sets this pattern of default attention. Of course, you could have event attention. You know, you could have a leader in a smaller country doing something that really attracts sustained attention. Think of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia in the 1990s. But it's to his disadvantage, and certainly was to Slobodan Milosevic's disadvantage, to attract that attention. And he couldn't control the outcomes. So that A to B relationship is important. Is it a relationship of domination? Not necessarily. We're talking about a default attention pattern, not necessarily. B can be Vietnam resisting China in 1979. B can be Ukraine now. It still has this informational relationship. This still has this attention relationship, regardless of the resistance. Attention does not mean deference, does not necessarily mean deference, does not necessarily mean submitting. Okay, the second thing is centrality sets default leadership. You look at C. I put C in the middle because it's larger than all the others. And it's because it's larger than all the others, it's going to be getting more attention than the others. And not only that, but because it's in a region here, it will be the center of communications for the region. It will be the place that everybody, whose media everybody is going to take more seriously than the media of some other small country in this network. And the reason I say that sets default leadership is that if everybody's looking at this central power, it's not dominant power, but it's a capacity, then if the region faces climate change problems or something like that, if C comes up with a solution to that, it's more likely to become a group action than if F does. F is going to have to persuade everybody to take it seriously and then take the idea seriously. So there's a setting of default leadership in a pattern of asymmetric attention. And then the credibility of the leader depends on two things. First of all, the interactive consistency. If you don't know how you're going to be dealing with the center keeps hopping around. I won't name any current examples of this, but I think there are some, at least one. And so that creates a cloud of ambiguity in the middle. So you're still watching it, but you don't know what the hell it's going to do next. And you're going to more protect yourself from the ambiguities that your exposure necessarily creates. That'll be a basic thing you don't want to do. The second thing on credibility is if the larger country is enabling common purposes, then you're attracted to the larger country. If Belt and Road Initiative is helping China's neighbors and countries beyond, then it's hardly surprising that those countries would support it. If Putin is invading Ukraine, it's hardly surprising that the other former parts of the Soviet Union would be scared and would resist and edge away from Russia. So enabling common purposes is an essential part of successful default leadership. Now, following Krishan's suggestion of going to examples from empire, I'd like to talk about traditional China's relationship to Southeast Asia. And what I'm going to be emphasizing the positive of this. And if you know a whole lot about the history of China and Southeast Asia, you can certainly think of exceptions to what I'm going to say. But I think this is overall true. And overall, it's the latent reason, the sort of historical inertial reason of the kind that Krishan was describing that accounts for the positive relationship in general between Southeast Asia and China today. The first thing is that China's centrality in its region, in Southeast Asia, was not control. It was centrality because China had location. It had a presence to the region like no other country did. It was right there on the northern border. It had population. It had always had over half the population of all of Pacific Asia. And thirdly, it had production. It was producing silk and porcelain and tea and those are three major products that circulated in the region and were products that people wanted. And so those trading patterns for those products and other products became important. So it had centrality. And to illustrate that, the Mongolian word for the East is left. And why would Mongolia have the word for east be left? Because when you're facing China and Mongolia, the east is to the left. So that idea of centrality is built into the language there, the idea of China's centrality. Now notice this, for most of the time, China was defensive, especially in this relationship, or actually was pacific in this relationship and not offensive in the relationship. And the exception would be the invasion of Vietnam in 1409. And that exception proves the rule because the Ming Dynasty lost and Vietnam, after the Ming Dynasty's army was defeated, what did the Vietnam do? It sent the generals and the horses back to Beijing and apologized for the discomfort that they had had in Vietnam. And after a few years, China recognized the new dynasty, the Lei dynasty. And from that time, with very few exceptions, for about 400 years, the relationship was stable. Why was it stable? Well, that gets us to the tribute system here. The key of the tribute system wasn't a goods exchange. The key of this tribute system was China's recognition of the autonomy of neighbors in exchange for their deference to China's system. And the reason I emphasize it, think about if you're Vietnam and you got this major border with China, you want China to recognize that you're in charge down here. Okay, that's the main thing, because you know China's very big. And if China wanted to take your country, they could, as they did in 1409. So you want that recognition of autonomy, and the emperor granted seals of authority periodically, and there were tribute missions that exchanged reciprocal gifts that were primarily important because of their recognition of each other. The emperor would give gifts that were worth more than the gifts that he was receiving. So you had this exchange of autonomy for deference. Why was China interested in deference? Because it didn't want trouble down there. It had enough trouble on the northern border with the Mongols and the Manchus and everybody. And the tribute system also applied there, but there was a very different game up there. But in the South, this recognition of autonomy for deference was very important. Was it simply an ecology of common systems? Well, Vietnam had a similar system, but in other cases in Southeast Asia, the influence of India and the influence eventually of Islam were much greater than China's influence. But China could cope with those differences as long as they knew what the system was. So there was an overarching assumption of civilization there. Of course, that was then, this is now. It's a different world. The relationships now are thick relationships in every dimension. The relationship is thicker. And these tribute mission relationships were thin and controlled relationships, to establish that the relationships would not go out of hand. It wasn't to maximize the relationship. It was to keep the relationship from getting out of hand. Okay, now relationships, the whole idea is to have as big a relationship, trade relationship, investment relationship, et cetera, as possible. Second thing, you couldn't have the patriarchy. You couldn't have the assumption of inequality, of status inequality in the present world that you had in the traditional Chinese empire, as Keping pointed out. And the third thing is there's no regional horizons. Why could China operate the way it did? Because given the logistics, given the information, given the general course of contact between Europe and Pacific Asia, it could assume that things beyond the horizons of the immediate region were not going to change things much. That was true till the Opium War, until the the ships started to arrive. Now you don't have regional horizons like that. And we would, what's the difference? Could China now has a relationship of 3 times the GDP of Southeast Asia. The United States has a relationship of 3 times the GDP of South America. So they're similar in that respect. But if either tries to put a fence around their close regions, they will find that will be unacceptable to the other members because that sacrifices their autonomy. So back to the autonomy rule, the thing you can learn from traditional China and its diplomacy is take autonomy seriously of smaller powers. If you don't, the relationship will be built on coercion, and coercion is a losing resource in a post-hegemonic world. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for all the wonderful discussions. And I'm really impressed by the ability of our prolific authors to actually squeeze everything on such a grand topic in 17 minutes. So first of all, I want to highlight how the presentations together form a really effective roadmap for us to navigate these complex issues with ease. Krishan began by showing why the question of empire is relevant, and Keping drew a line between the imperial past and the need for a new model of global governance, describing imperialism as a transitional temptation. And John emphasized that even in the post-imperial era, great powers continue to engineer the international environment in ways that advance national interests. And Brantly inspired us to consider power disparities in an era beyond hegemony and highlighting the relevance of traditional China and the Southeast Asia relations for managing centrality. So all our panelists suggest that we live in, to my understanding, a paradoxical relationship with empire. On one hand, the nation-state framework appears to mark a departure from empires, relegating them to historical reference point. On the other hand, interstate relations remain influenced by imperial ambitions and arrangement. Empire continue to provide an important lens through which we imagine and organize political power beyond the nation state, whether it is about international governance, global connectivity, duties and responsibility of global and regional powers, or contemporary form of imperialism. Despite their lost legitimacy, historical empires may even offer useful lessons for modern polities, imagine domestic diversity and interstate power asymmetry. While all our speakers underscore the intrinsic ties between the present and our imperial past, they also point towards directions into which we can imagine future beyond empires. For Krishan, it is some new forms of commonwealth nations. For Keping, it's global governance and civil society. For John, it's expansion of liberal alliance. And for Brantly, it's a construction of connectivity and codependence without paternalism. Whatever the specific scenario would be, all four presentations implicitly converge on a fundamental sociological question: what enables a nation to come together and what drives them apart? And I think in our confusing and turbulent times, all these factors that we rely on to construct connectivity today are in scramble. So we are still witnessing what kind of forces will come out of this mix and shape the decades to come. But what is certain, as we learn from this symposium, is that revisiting the history of empires and imperialism, as Keping reminds us, is increasingly important, not to repeat past blunders, but to draw from history in generating collective and innovative solutions. So I know that the success of a discussion is defined by ability to stimulating debates, but I actually want to defer that to the audience who ask pointed and sharp questions. Instead, I will pose some initial questions for all panelists to think about. First, I would like to ask about the relation between national and international polities in the spirit of John's discussion of regimes. Historically, the so-called liberal empires face a fundamental tension between the rising demands for democracy and equality at home and the maintaining dominance and hierarchy abroad. The United States attempt to close this gap in the second half of the 20th century through the project of global liberalism and as a model of democracy. In the past decade, however, this tension has reemerged in the new and transformed ways, with rising domestic discontent coinciding with great power overreach abroad. Meanwhile, China, a non-democratic region at home, has become a leading champion of global connectivity and international development. That this suggests that we are witnessing a decoupling of a national and a global politics, both in policy and ideology. Must the future be maintained through a realistic separation of the two, as the liberal empire attempted? Second, the topic globalization has appeared in various ways in the presentations. May I also take the opportunity to invite the panelists to think about the relation between empires and globalization. In the imperial age, globalization, quote unquote, largely operated under the empirical framework as a historical Silk Road has suggested. Today, it is not too distant analogy to suggest that globalization still has patrons of global powers. In particular, its infrastructural platform has been controlled and maintained by great powers, including the finance, global finance, supply chains, energy supplies, and also international law, transportation networks, and increasing so digital and data infrastructure, as our own and Caucus has shown. So the question then comes to, can globalization still act as an antidote to empire? Or does it merely channel influence into new forms? And the last question I have, I will be brief. I can't resist asking what comes next. While the older model of global liberalism is on the defensive, a new alternative has yet emerged. What might fill the void in the global project, if there is a project to be continued? What seems on the horizon today is a sort of watered down version of what has been practiced in the 20th century, as some see China offering a pragmatic vision of development with lessons to be learned for the global South. Others attempt to revive this old idea of sphere of influence to achieve a new equilibrium. So I think Brantly's presentation has already suggested towards some kind of forms of new form of connectivity and the hope and the cooperation. So are there further thoughts on how the next iteration of global governance might actually take shape in concrete forms? So I will end here and hoping these questions can actually, kind of break ice and serve as a conversation starters. And I'm sure that new questions will emerge from the audience, and I will end here and I'll leave time for that. And I think all panelists can choose and pick the questions I posed, and I'm sure that you also observe each other, the contact points that you shared in your presentation as well. So so we can have a discussion. Also, the floor is open for questions.
But I think John raised questions about that. I would say that Keping and myself would say, yes, it is an antidote, though globalization is certainly, it's not global springtime in the sense of everybody understanding each other and only pursuing common interests.
I'll respond to, I don't want to interfere with that line of thinking, but I do want to respond to the first question, Yingyao, about you asked if there might be a decoupling between domestic and international, let's say. I want to clarify one thing. I wasn't arguing that there's a congruence between domestic and international in the sense that a liberal democracy like the United States wants the world to be a liberal democracy. It had, by and large, all else equal, wanted more democracies out there, nation states, but the global system the U.S. has been pushing for, I don't think you can call a liberal democracy. And in fact, China is extremely pluralistic about other countries' domestic systems. The United States has historically been far less pluralistic. It's wanted more liberal democracies out there. And if couldn't get that, it wanted anti-communist regimes, whatever. It really took a keen interest in the domestic makeup of other countries out of its liberal principles. China, as far as I can tell, not at all. China wants to do business with countries. It doesn't really care what their domestic regime type is. So, but all of that is in service of what I was calling a national interest. So I just want to clarify that the simple reading that China wants a world governed by something like the Chinese Communist Party and the United States wants a big liberal global. That wasn't the argument. It's really a bit more complex than that. Getting back to this globalization as the antidote to empire, that's a terrific question. I have seen globalization as an extension of U.S. hegemony. And now that is less the case as China has become more powerful. So I have not seen it as an antidote to empire, but international hierarchy in a different form. And now you have these two great powers in a globalized system, both trying to exert influence over it, competing over that. So, but I'm going to think more about this because I think, globalization clearly is not formal empire as we've been talking about it, but I think it is still part and parcel of great power hierarchy, just taking a very different form. That's my initial take on that question.
Can I just add to that point? Because I think, Yingyao, you raised the question of globalization versus empire, but I very much agree with John that when I think back at the past, the greatest impulses towards globalization have been through the empires. And this was one of the great points I think Neil Ferguson made in his series on the British Empire. He called it Anglobalization. You just think of the extension of British institutions, British culture, the British language, et cetera, around the world through its empire. The same with the French, the second largest empire in the world. America, similarly in the 20th century, or Russia across that great swathe of Eurasia, the Russian Empire. And I suppose China with Confucianism spilling over the boundaries of China into Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and maybe even Siam. I mean, so the empires, it seems to me, have been the carriers of globalization, not the opponent of it. Now, of course, they carried a certain character with them. It was the character of the dominant nation, the British, the French, the Americans. So yes, it's not globalization in any way like a universal sense. But nevertheless, they were globalizers, and they left the legacy, I think, of a certain kind of globalization, which maybe we can build on. It's not necessarily in opposition.
Today's globalization is different because it has a different substrate of logistics, of information, of media, of interaction, trade, especially. This is a much thicker relationship now than it was before. And that's the relationship that any political, regardless of how it got there, regardless of whose purposes globalization served, the globalization that exists now is something that I think would make it very difficult to establish a hegemonic control. Although I think that Trump himself is monetizing the American contribution, both for his own purposes and for national purposes. And that de-globalization of the American position is very interesting in its own right.
I would like to answer the question, but I would like to speak in Chinese due to my poor English. So Yingyao will help me for interpreting. 我认为全球化呢，现在全世界好像掀起一股反对全球化或者去全球化的这样一个高潮。但是我自己呢是一个全球化的一个坚定的一个倡导者。我认为全球化事实上现在它是不可阻挡的。现在出现的反全球化，恰恰是全球化进程中一个必经的环节。因为在这个过程当中，有一些国家它的利益受损了，他们都把它归咎为全球化。比方说像英国它的脱欧那么包括像美国，现在川普他要从全球化的许多合作当中这个退出来。事实上呢，恰恰是全球化进程的一个必然的结果。
So Professor, you said anti-globalization is definitely on the rise, but he thinks that anti-globalization is the other side of globalization, actually kind of attesting to the inevitable change of globalization as sort of a backlash against some of its side effects.
但是全球化呢，现在到了这个阶段呢，它确实有很多新的变化，特别是呢，所以我在刚才讲的全球化时代的时候，我过去一直讲全球化时代，现在我会加上一个数字时代，就 digitalization。我认为全球化现在会采取一些新的形式，所以我们需要就各个国家事实上呢已经需要应对全球化的一些新的政策。比方说那个 比特币，就是这种电子货币，它实际上是不可阻挡的。还有像那个AI 和那个数据，它事实上呢更需要各个国家之间相互的这个合作。所以我自己的一个最后的结论就是，我认为恰恰是全球化它的不可阻挡，它又要采取新的形式。所以呢，这个帝国的时代它事实上就是过去了。
Globalization had reached a new phase, which is a digital globalization, such as manifesting in the Bitcoin phenomenon, that how AI and data information revolution has sort of prepared a new need to cooperation and then data sharing, in the sense that this is attesting to the new evidence that globalization has reinvented itself, that overall, I think it fits to the overall trend that globalization is inevitable.
也就是说，最后呢，每一个国家最后都会发现，在这样的一个全球化时代，如果跟其他国家对立，而不是合作，其实最后呢，它会损害自己的利益，不光是损害对方的利益。所以我是特别相信啊，就是为人类这个未来的出路啊，是进入更多的合作，而不是对抗。
Many countries realize that if you stand on the opposite side of other countries, you actually see your own interest lost in that way. So globalization will motivate new forms of cooperation going forward. All right, so floor is finally open for questions. Yes.
Well, thank you so much. I only have a couple minutes before I miss my train, so thank you so much for letting me ask the first question. So this is actually not only my question, but a question my students in my class that has been working with. So as a quick introduction, I'm a fourth year PhD at Johns Hopkins, and the question I have is on this problem of international public good. Because one thing for this hegemonic system, its ability for hegemon to deliver public good, as many IR scholars has argued, and for hegemons, them delivering public good, you just sort of overcome the Orson's problem collective action. However, if we go beyond the hegemonic system and truly move into a system, international system of power or country equality, then what to do with public good? How do we overcome the Orson problem of collective action? Thank you.
Great question. I don't want to make you miss your train from giving a long answer. But it's a problem that's also not necessarily solved by having a hegemon. But if you don't have a hegemon, then how do you get that type of coordination? Well, coordination on common purposes. If you look at the British Commonwealth, I should say, it does get some things in common and make states want to be members, former colonies and also not former colonies. Mozambique was never a colony of Britain, and now it's a member of the Commonwealth, even though its state language is Portuguese. So you have that type of attraction as long as there's no risk. Notice autonomy. There's no question of autonomy in that. Look at ASEAN as a unit. Very successful, slow, because it's built on agreement by everyone. So that type of approach of building on agreement toward common purposes, I think, is something that has a future in a post-hegemonic world.
And I would just add that the conventional IR point that a more thickly institutionalized order is more likely to provide public goods because transaction costs of cooperation go down. That's Robert Cohen's theory. I think it doesn't solve all problems. And even he would admit hegemony makes public goods provision easier, but it's not necessary. And I think that's basically right. And so one worry some of us have about what's going on in the world now is the institutionalization is weakening because of this hegemon, the United States. And so it's a problem that's coming to the fore again. So your question is quite acute, but the remedy I think has to lie in a post-hegemonic world in institutions.
So I have two questions. The first one is to John, and the second one will be to Brantly and Keping. So the first one. Now, when we talk about this ecosystem engineering, So we have this assumption that states like their domestic regime has got them here, and they want to keep that domestic regime. Now, I think what we observe in America now is that at least, let's say, a significant part of the population are not really happy with the domestic regime that got them there. And we observe that in the ruling, let's say, ruling elite as well. Now, the question is that not from a historical perspective, is that something rather unique, or do we observe this kind of situation before as well?
It is not, it's, I want to say rare. It is untypical. It is certainly not unheard of. I want to draw on, and first of all, revolutions happen, coup d'etat happen, right? I want to be very careful. I am not drawing, this analogy does not imply, it's a limited analogy. It's not implying that the MAGA movement is Nazi. Okay, just to make sure. Maybe some of you may believe it is. That's not implied here. But I actually published a paper last year about how both in Italy and in Germany in the 20s and 30s, the far right parties didn't like the League of Nations system, and connected to that, they didn't like their own domestic regime, which was liberal democratic. Italy went to fascism in the very early 20s, Germany to Nazism in 1933. So the German case is a little more instructive, but there you have a case of more or less what I'm talking about, this idea that we don't like our domestic regime because it's holding us down, and the international system, this League of Nations system, is pressuring us to remain the Weimar Republic. And so the way to free us up to be a truly great Germany is to effect regime change. And then we can break free also of these international fetters, right? So that's a really extreme, gloomy, quite disturbing case, but I pick it out because it actually makes the point quite stark. So there is precedent, and there are good precedents as well. There are regime change where a country wants to become, a republic or more democratic so that it can participate more fully in the liberal international system. All right. So it works both ways. But more typically, year in and year out, I think my argument holds that states generally, if you want to predict what regime type a state will have next year, look at what regime type it has this year. But thanks for the good question.
So my next question to Brantly, so around 2006, 2008, there was this discussion about the KSIPC. Then the first, when John Owen, I think, first raised that question, it was about global governance, like what they talked about today. And there quickly was a lot of criticism about this being a form of neo-imperialism. And I think what it shows in the end is that there's some kind of trade-off between this global governance, the notion of global governance, and the notion of autonomy, as Brantly mentioned today. Yeah. So I guess the question is just, how do we evaluate this trade-off?
That is an excellent question. I think it's a real problem in the discussions in China about foreign policy and external relations. There's a tendency, I would say, of large countries in general, but certainly China as well, to assume that something that is win-win must be acceptable to both sides and advance common purposes. But the thing is, in asymmetric relationships, the wins are not equal. If building a railroad a high-speed railroad from China to Singapore looks like a win-win to China, a win-win to Singapore, win-win to Vietnam, through which it would have to go, yes, but it also exposes Vietnam, which has had problems with China in the past 4,000 years, to high-speed rail access to the whole country. So they are going to be, even though they want better transportation, and this would help domestic transportation, they are hesitant to accept something like that. So that whole question of sensitivity to autonomy and insensitivity to autonomy is very important. it's been recognized, 大国主义, 大汉主义, big countryism, big Hanism. These things have been criticized from the 1950s, but they keep on being criticized because they're still there. That just like, the ugly American in relationships to smaller countries, and U.S. relationships with Latin America. It's a problem that large countries have because the relationship is just they're not as exposed in those relationships as the counterpart country.
U.S. and Canada. I
Yeah.
my wife Canada. So.
谢谢你的问题。从这个20世纪以后呢，天下这个问题在中国知识界呢是一场热烈的讨论，不光是国际关系，包括哲学、政治学。那么总体上来讲呢，它事实上有两种观点，一种呢是把天下这个体系呢是认为是可以给现在的全球秩序啊提供一个基本的一个理想的这种模式。特别推重天下体，特别是你刚才提到的像赵鼎阳先生他们这样的，这是非常多的一些学者的看法。但是另外一种反对的观点是不同的，反对观点认为呢，就是这个现在这个国际政治体系，它是后威斯特法利亚时代，它是建立在主权国家之上的。中国传统的天下体系是不适应的所以现在呢，就是在这两种观点之间呢，我自己等一下我谈我的看法，我先让英瑶帮我翻译一下。
In fact, this idea of Tianxia has become a center of debate in philosophy, politics, sociology, international relations in the 21st century in China. There are two major camps or opinions. The first camp opinion argue that maybe the Tianxia idea can provide some model for reordering the global world. And the second opinion, and this is the majority opinion, and the second opposing opinion argue that, well, in today's world that is constituted of sovereign nations, it's actually very hard to propagate this idea.
我自己的看法是这样的。首先呢，我不同意就是天下论者他们反对使用帝国的概念，他们认为帝国是一个西方的概念，完全不能解释中国传统的这种这个秩序体系。这个点我是不同意。我认为帝国这个概念照样也可以解释中国的历史上的一些政治结构。
I think that those who think agree with the Tianxia idea tend to argue that the idea of empire was no longer irrelevant to explaining the Chinese history. But I think that we still need to admit that China was an empire and the imperial framework was still relevant to explaining what happened.
但是我觉得中国传统的天下体系呢，确实是值得我们现在借鉴的，特别是两点。第一呢，就是处理大国与小国的关系，这一点像刚才 Brantly 说的，它是中心与其他小国，这个是我觉得很好的一种，就是友好平等的这样一种模式，没有发生冲突，这一点是可取的。第二呢，就是这种天下的关系呢，它主张和平，它反对战争，这一点在当代世界尤其值得倡导。
I think that being said, we still can borrow some of the insights for the Tianxia idea, and then for mainly two reasons. One is Tianxia might be useful framework to managing big power and a small power relationship, especially if emphasis on equality and friendliness might be a source of inspiration. The second is overall the idea of Tianxia emphasis on peace instead of war.
但是呢，最后一点呢，我认为呢，就是天下这个体系毕竟是几千年以前，跟现在呢这个整个的背景完全不同了。那现在寻求国际这个理想的世界秩序，还是呢要建立在现代民族主权国家这样的一个基本的现实之上。所以我自己在倡导的是一种叫做全球善治。我觉得只有这个是我认为就是天下是无法就是这个替代的，全球善治应当是现在全球化时代最理想的国际秩序。谢谢。
But right now, the international environment that sustains Tianxia is no longer present here. So I champion still this idea of global good governance that might be more appropriate to survive and thrive in today's world. We still have some time for questions.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak to us today. Also, we've had some really compelling presentations. My question is for anyone who'd like to answer it. When we think kind of historically of empire, we have to also think about capital. A lot of theorists of empire also claim that, the idea of empire is inseparable from the idea of capital and capital accumulation. My question is, in a world, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, when people as citizens and as kind of in states as well have expressed dissatisfaction with modes and norms of capital accumulation, not only within countries, but between countries as well, how can we see that translating into things like neo-imperialism or this new kind of globalization that we now face?
I'm always very puzzled by this view that empire and capitalism somehow are intrinsically related, and that the only way to understand empire is through the lens of capitalism. Because it's so obvious to me and to everybody, I think, who's looked at empire, that empire is much, much older than what we might call modern capitalism. And I mean, the form of empire goes back well into history. We could talk about Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire. So you might want to argue that with the coming of modern capitalism, some new element was added. Partly it was the slave trade. I mean, that was certainly one of the elements that the modern European empires added to the imperial story. But I'm puzzled. I'd like to know what is it about capitalism that many people feel is somehow the clue to empire, that without it we can't understand it. Because as far as I can see, the empires of the modern period are actually a minority of the empires that we have to look at. If you look at world history, the empires are everywhere, east and west, north and south, and they're not, to me, specifically related to capitalism at all.
And that's a very good point. I should have clarified in my question that I meant empires as we think of modern empire post-slave trade. So not entirely like a very far-looking historical.
And what would be the link? I mean, why is it that capitalism for you is so important to understand modern empires? What is the link in your mind?
Well, actually, that was kind of the view that I was hoping to get from you guys. This is my personal opinion. I have read a couple of papers on it in my international relations classes, and was kind of intrigued by this thing.
I can comment. I do share my colleagues' view. The link is, I think it's fair to say, first drawn by John Hobson in 1902 with Imperialism, a Study, and then picked up by people like Rosa Luxemburg, Rudolf Hilferding, and Lenin himself. And there are more current versions, right? Negri and Hart recently. The early versions were sort of paid to my satisfaction by later historians in the 50s and 60s who actually looked at the scramble for Africa and said, the case that this is capital seeking a higher return on investment just doesn't hold up empirically. So if we want to redefine imperialism, as Lenin in a way did, as capitalism in its latest phase, then it becomes unfalsifiable. If it's just a matter of definition. But if we want to make a causal argument, I still think the burden remains on people who think capitalism is a cause of empire. And I'm not satisfied. So.
Thanks to all of you for really interesting presentations. I was really struck by Brantly's observation about the characteristics of modern hegemony, so to speak, the disappearance of regional boundaries, the thickness of interaction, which I think has largely been the case for the past 30 years. That may have changed with the arrival of the Trump administration. In January, on his very first day of administration, he sent a signal that China must get out of Panama, otherwise Panama would have to give up the Panama Canal back to us again. And more recently, China's negotiating tactic in the current trade talks with the United States, and maybe beyond the current trade talks, on the rare earths, basically imposing a kind of export control system that the United States has been practicing on the trade of sensitive technology. So where is this headed? I'd be very curious in the panel's views. Will, for example, China have been basically tolerant of Southeast Asian nations, whether it's Thailand or the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, having an active relationship with the United States? Will that kind of relationship come under pressure? In other words, will there be more regional constraints that China is expecting more deference to its interests from the smaller nations of Southeast Asia?
Well, I could say so far so good. We were just talking about China and Southeast Asia. China has reaffirmed that it should be an inclusive relationship. And it's interesting when you look at partnerships of a country like Vietnam, it has strategic partnerships with China, Russia, United States, India, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and there's no grumpy statements from China when Trump visits Vietnam, for instance. What China does, though, is try to arrange a comparable visit of Chinese dignitaries. So you have this tendency to trade off, but not to put a fence up. And if the Trump administration tries to put a fence around South America, it is going to discover that doesn't work, that there's going to be fence jumpers and people pulling and tugging on the fence and doing all sorts of things, because China is already the largest trading partner of the region. So more excitement to come. I think we can say that's the future.
This could definitely be from a political psychology angle as well, or my question, but I was thinking about COVID-19 as well as already the effects of climate change sort of being uprooters of the liberal order that has been moving forward throughout much less since Cold War. Would you say that climate change does have that potential for destabilizing that order and then create more isolationist driven regional alliances? And if so, are those theoretical alliances adequate enough to prevent further imperialism as well as military aggression when Beijing over invasion of Ukraine? Like, any thoughts on that?
自己知道这个全球变暖这个问题呢，在科学界以及在美国都有争论，但是我自己认为的全球变暖就是事实上是对人类的一种威胁。我自己认为这个全球在这个当代世界各个国家还是应当这个合作来控制这个全球变暖。虽然有很多不确定的因素，但是很可能它会带来灾难。如果我们能够预防它，那么对人类未来就会是一个创造更好的条件。
Global warming is a major threat to human civilization. If we can cooperate together, maybe we can prevent it, but otherwise it will be a disaster.
I'll just assimilate the question back into the question of global public goods asked a minute ago. And I think the remedies mostly require international cooperation on a massive scale. That's a type of public good. And so absent hegemony, it really requires institutions that are weakening. So we have a collective choice. Nothing's predetermined, but I'm not optimistic at this moment that we're headed in the right direction there and in any number of other global public goods. Sorry to be pessimistic.
I don't have anything to add to what my colleagues have just said, so I'll pass it on to Brantly.
Well, the difference between the current American position on climate change and the Chinese position on climate change is certainly significant. And I think that China is going to gain stature in the world because of the stand that it's taken, and the U.S. will be increasingly isolated by the stand that it's taken. So in that sense, there could be some type of medium or long-term situation where China taking the, you might say, more positive position will work to its its rivalry advantage as well as to the possible advantage of institutional matters.
Right, let's end this symposium on Brantly summer optimistic note. And thank you so much for sticking around, and please join me in thanking all the wonderful presentations, all the panelists today.